Ruthless bikers mock a homeless veteran. When he reveals who he is, they collapse in fear. In the heart of a small, quiet town, a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves of the old oak trees lining the streets. The sun cast a warm glow over the quaint houses and small businesses, creating an idyllic scene that belied the darkness lurking beneath the surface. For years, the town had been plagued by a group of ruthless bikers who ruled the streets through fear and intimidation. The bikers, known as the Wolves, were a menacing presence in the town. They roared through the streets on their gleaming motorcycles, their leather jackets emblazoned with the image of a snarling wolf. The townspeople knew to keep their heads down and avoid eye contact when the wolves were around, lest they become targets of their cruelty. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the wolves descended upon the town's central park. They swaggered through the green space, their laughter harsh and grating, seeking out their next victim. It was then that they spotted him, a homeless veteran sitting quietly on a bench, his weathered face etched with lines of sorrow and pain. The wolves approached the veteran, their eyes glinting with malice. They circled him like predators, taunting and mocking him, unaware of the truth of who he was and the connection he had to someone far more powerful. As the bikers continued their cruel behavior, a figure watched from the shadows. He was a quiet and humble man, known only as John to the townspeople. John had seen the wolves' reign of terror firsthand, but he had never intervened, choosing instead to keep to himself and focus on his own life. But as he watched the bikers harass the veteran, something stirred within him. He recognized the man on the bench, a flicker of familiarity sparking in his eyes. The veteran, named Samuel, had a past intertwined with John's own, a bond forged in the crucible of war and sacrifice. John stepped out of the shadows, his presence commanding attention despite his unassuming demeanor. The wolves turned to face him, their sneers fading as they took in his calm, steady gaze. "Leave him be," John said, his voice low but firm. "He's done nothing to you." The leader of the wolves, a hulking man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you to tell us what to do?" John met the leader's gaze unflinchingly. "Someone who knows the true meaning of strength and courage." With those words, John helped Samuel to his feet, guiding him away from the bikers. The wolves watched them go, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. They had never encountered someone who dared to stand up to them, and the quiet confidence in John's demeanor unsettled them. As John and Samuel walked through the park, the veteran looked up at his old friend, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "I didn't expect anyone to come to my aid." John smiled, placing a comforting hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You're not alone, my friend. This town is full of good people, and it's time we started standing up for what's right." And with those words, the seeds of change were planted, a small act of kindness and courage that would grow into something far more powerful than the wolves could ever imagine. In the days that followed John's encounter with the wolves, a subtle shift began to take place in the small town. Whispers of John's bravery spread like wildfire, igniting a spark of hope in the hearts of the townspeople. They had lived under the oppressive shadow of the bikers for so long that they had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand tall and unafraid. John, for his part, continued to go about his life as usual. He worked quietly at his small carpentry shop, crafting beautiful pieces of furniture that brought joy to the homes of his customers. But even as he focused on his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had a greater purpose, a calling to help his community break free from the grip of fear. One morning, as John walked to his shop, he noticed a group of children playing in the street. They were laughing and chasing each other, their faces alight with innocent joy. But as soon as the roar of motorcycle engines filled the air, the children scattered, their laughter replaced by looks of terror. John watched as the wolves tore through the street, their bikes kicking up clouds of dust and gravel. The leader, the man with the scar, caught sight of John and sneered, revving his engine in a clear display of intimidation. But John refused to be cowed. He met the leader's gaze calmly, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. In that moment, he knew that he could no longer stand idly by while the wolves terrorized his town. As the bikers disappeared around the corner, John turned to see Samuel standing nearby, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. The veteran had seen firsthand the cruelty of the wolves, and he knew all too well the price of standing up to them. "I don't know if I have the strength to fight them," Samuel said quietly, his voice trembling. "I've seen too much violence in my life already." John placed a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. "You don't have to fight them alone," he said. "We're in this together, and there are others in this town who feel the same way we do." As if on cue, a small group of townspeople emerged from the nearby buildings, their faces filled with a newfound sense of purpose. They had heard about John's encounter with the wolves, and they were ready to take a stand. Among them was Sarah, the owner of the local diner. She had watched for years as the wolves harassed her customers and vandalized her property, but she had always been too afraid to speak out. Now, seeing the courage in John's eyes, she felt a flicker of hope that things could be different. "We're with you, John," she said, her voice filled with determination. "It's time we took our town back from those thugs." John looked around at the small group of people, his heart swelling with pride. He knew that they were just a handful of individuals, but together, they had the power to create real change. "We start with small acts of kindness and courage," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "We show the wolves that we're not afraid, and we build a community that stands together against their cruelty." As the group dispersed, each person filled with a newfound sense of purpose, John turned to Samuel, a small smile playing on his lips. "This is just the beginning, my friend," he said. "Together, we'll show the wolves what true strength really looks like." As the weeks passed, the small acts of kindness and courage that John had spoken of began to take root in the town. People started looking out for one another, offering help and support wherever they could. They smiled at each other on the streets, shared meals together, and worked side by side to beautify their community. Sarah, the diner owner, started offering free meals to those in need, including Samuel and other homeless veterans who had fallen on hard times. She created a warm and welcoming atmosphere in her restaurant, a place where people could come together and feel a sense of belonging. Other business owners followed suit, opening their doors to the community and creating spaces where people could gather and connect. The local bookstore started hosting reading groups and poetry nights, while the hardware store offered free workshops on home repair and gardening. As the town began to come together, the wolves started to take notice. They watched with growing unease as the people they had once terrorized started to stand tall and unafraid. They saw the way that John and Samuel walked through the streets with their heads held high, and they couldn't understand where this newfound confidence had come from. One evening, as John and Samuel were walking home from a community gathering, they were confronted by the leader of the wolves. The man with the scar stepped out from the shadows, his eyes glinting with malice. "You think you're so tough, don't you?" he sneered, his hand hovering over the knife at his belt. "You think you can just walk around like you own this town?" John met the man's gaze calmly, his voice steady and clear. "We don't want any trouble," he said. "We just want to live our lives in peace." The leader laughed, a harsh and grating sound. "Peace," he spat. "There's no peace in this world, only power. And we have all the power here." With a flick of his wrist, the man drew his knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. Samuel tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. But John remained calm, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. "You're wrong," he said softly. "True power comes from the strength of a community, from the love and compassion we show one another. And that's something you'll never understand." The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lunge forward with his knife. But something in John's gaze made him hesitate, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "This isn't over," he growled, before turning and stalking away into the night. As the sound of the leader's footsteps faded away, Samuel let out a shaky breath. "That was too close," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "What if he had attacked us?" John placed a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. "He wouldn't have," he said calmly, "because he knows, deep down, that we're not afraid of him anymore. And that scares him more than any knife ever could." Samuel looked at John, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He had spent so long living in fear, hiding from the violence and cruelty of the world, that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up for himself. But now, seeing the courage and compassion in John's eyes, he felt a flicker of hope that things could be different. As the two men walked home through the quiet streets, they knew that the battle was far from over. The wolves would not give up their hold on the town easily, and there would be many more challenges to come. But for the first time in a long time, they felt a sense of hope and purpose, a belief that together, they could create a better world. As the days turned into weeks, the small town continued to thrive under the growing influence of John and the community he had helped to build. The wolves, once a constant menace, now seemed to fade into the background, their presence diminished by the newfound strength and unity of the townspeople. But even as the town flourished, John knew that the battle was far from over. He had seen the anger and resentment in the eyes of the wolves' leader, and he knew that the man would not rest until he had regained control of the streets. One afternoon, as John and Samuel were walking through the park, they heard a commotion in the distance. The sound of motorcycles filled the air, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. As they rounded the corner, they saw a sight that made their blood run cold. The wolves had returned, and this time, they had brought reinforcements. Dozens of bikers lined the streets, their engines revving and their faces twisted into sneers of contempt. At the head of the pack was the leader, the man with the scar. He sat astride his motorcycle, his eyes blazing with fury as he stared down at John and Samuel. "You thought you could just take over our town?" he growled, his voice dripping with venom. "You thought you could just push us out and pretend like we never existed?" John stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "We don't want to push anyone out," he said. "We just want to create a community where everyone can feel safe and valued, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The leader laughed, a harsh and grating sound. "Safe and valued?" he spat. "There's no such thing in this world. You're either the one with the power, or you're the one getting crushed beneath it." With a nod of his head, the leader signaled to his men, and the wolves began to advance, their engines roaring like a pack of hungry predators. But as they drew closer, something unexpected happened. From every corner of the town, people began to emerge, their faces set with determination and their eyes blazing with purpose. They came from the diner and the bookstore, from the hardware store and the community center. They came armed not with weapons, but with the strength of their convictions and the power of their unity. As the townspeople surrounded the wolves, their presence a silent but powerful rebuke, the bikers began to falter. They had never seen anything like this before, a community that stood together against their cruelty and their violence. The leader, his face twisted with rage, revved his engine and prepared to charge forward. But before he could make a move, Samuel stepped out from the crowd, his eyes locked on the man who had once terrorized him. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he said softly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "You don't remember the man you mocked and harassed in the park all those weeks ago?" The leader's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "You're just a homeless veteran," he sneered. "A nobody." Samuel shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm more than that," he said. "I'm a soldier, a warrior, and I've seen things that you can't even imagine." With a deep breath, Samuel began to speak, his voice growing stronger and more powerful with each word. He told the story of his time in the military, of the battles he had fought and the sacrifices he had made. He spoke of the true meaning of strength and courage, of the power that comes not from violence and intimidation, but from compassion and unity. As Samuel spoke, the wolves began to shift uncomfortably on their bikes. They had never heard anyone talk like this before, with such conviction and such purpose. And as they listened, something began to change within them, a flicker of doubt and uncertainty that they had never felt before. When Samuel finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the crowd. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke, the only sound the distant chirping of birds in the trees. And then, slowly at first but with growing momentum, the townspeople began to clap. They clapped for Samuel and for John, for the courage and the compassion that had brought them all together. They clapped for the community they had built, a place where everyone was valued and everyone belonged. As the applause washed over them, the wolves began to back away, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. They had never encountered anything like this before, a force that was stronger and more powerful than anything they could ever hope to be. And as they rode off into the distance, their engines fading into the quiet of the afternoon, John and Samuel stood side by side, their hearts filled with a sense of pride and purpose. They had won a great victory that day, not through violence or intimidation, but through the power of love and compassion. And as they looked out over the town that had once been ruled by fear, they knew that the seeds of change had been planted, and that a new era of hope and unity was about to begin. In the days and weeks that followed the confrontation with the wolves, the small town underwent a profound transformation. The once quiet streets now buzzed with activity and laughter, as people of all ages and backgrounds came together to celebrate their newfound sense of community. At the heart of this transformation was John, the quiet carpenter who had become a symbol of hope and resilience for the entire town. Everywhere he went, people greeted him with smiles and words of thanks, their eyes shining with the knowledge that they had been part of something truly special. But even as the town thrived, John knew that there was still work to be done. The wolves may have been defeated, but the scars they had left behind would take time to heal. And so, with the help of Samuel and the other members of the community, John set about the task of rebuilding, not just the physical structures of the town, but the emotional and spiritual foundations as well. They started small, with simple acts of kindness and compassion. They organized food drives and clothing donations, reaching out to those who had been left behind by the wolves' reign of terror. They created support groups and counseling services, providing a safe space for people to share their stories and begin the process of healing. As the weeks turned into months, the town began to change in ways that no one could have predicted. The once boarded-up storefronts now bustled with activity, as new businesses opened their doors and old ones returned to life. The streets were filled with the sound of children playing and neighbors chatting, the fear and mistrust of the past slowly fading away. And at the center of it all was the park, the place where John and Samuel had first met and where the wolves had once held sway. But now, the park had been transformed into a symbol of hope and renewal, a green oasis in the heart of the town where people could come together and celebrate the power of community. One warm summer evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, John and Samuel sat together on a bench in the park, watching as the townspeople milled about, their faces alight with joy and laughter. "I never thought I'd see this day," Samuel said softly, his eyes misty with emotion. "After everything we've been through, after all the pain and the suffering, to see this town so full of life and hope. It's a miracle." John nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's more than a miracle," he said. "It's a testament to the strength and the resilience of the human spirit. When we come together, when we stand up for what's right and what's good, there's nothing we can't accomplish." As the two men sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the town around them, they knew that the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges to come, more obstacles to overcome. But they also knew that they had something that the wolves could never take away: the power of love and compassion, the strength of a community united in purpose and in hope. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm, golden glow, John and Samuel knew that they had been part of something truly special. They had helped to create a new world, a world where everyone was valued and everyone belonged. And though the road ahead might be long and difficult, they knew that they would face it together, united in the power of their shared humanity. As the townspeople began to drift away, heading home to their families and their loved ones, John and Samuel remained on the bench, watching as the stars began to appear in the sky above. And in that moment, they knew that they had found something that they had both been searching for all their lives: a sense of purpose, a reason to hope, and the knowledge that, no matter what the future might bring, they would never be alone. For in the end, that was the true power of community, the true strength of the human spirit. It was the knowledge that, even in the darkest of times, even in the face of the greatest of challenges, there was always a light to guide the way, always a hand to hold, always a reason to keep fighting for a better world. And as John and Samuel sat there, Surrounded by the love and the compassion of the town they had helped to build, they knew that they had found that light, and that it would guide them forward, now and forever.